Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Duesterberg. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson. And today we're going to tackle the burning issue of the federal debt. Here in Washington in the last few years, there seems to have been a joint conspiracy of silence in addressing in a serious and a constructive way the growing national debt that we have and the persistent federal budget deficits. Some of this was first begun in a major way during the COVID crisis, but that seems to have been then an ongoing excuse for deficit spending. A few months ago, the Senate Budget Committee had a hearing on the budget deficit, and Senator Romney, a longtime member of the committee, made this remark: "It's appropriate that this hearing is being held during the Academy Awards season. I'm afraid that what we're doing here is more Barbie than it is Oppenheimer," said Romney. The Budget Committee has spent more time talking about climate change than they have about the budget and cutting the deficit. The public thinks we work on the budget, but we don't, he said, adding that he wished lawmakers would meet to discuss how to deal with the debt. The same hearing, Senator Grassley said, "Over the break, I held 10 county meetings. In each and every one, Iowans voiced their dismay at the state of our nation's finances. They're furious about Congress's utter lack of attention to our bloated federal budget, as they should be." Well, the presidential campaigns don't seem to be making much more of an effort to address this issue in a systematic way. So I've gathered a couple old friends of mine and some of the nation's leading budget experts to explore ways in which we can more fulsomely address this problem. So let me give you a brief introduction to our guests. On my left is Dr. William Beach. He's now the Senior Fellow in Economics at the Economic Policy Innovation Center and associated with the Coolidge. He's a Coolidge Fellow at the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, which honors one of the nation's leading budget hawks in our history. Immediately before taking that position, Bill was the 15th Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington. He's had a long career addressing economic and budget issues. He was the chief economist for the Senate Budget Committee. He was a vice president for policy research at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and longtime senior fellow in economics at Heritage, and founder and director of the Foundation's Center for Data Analysis, which is one of the great tools we have in Washington to think about these issues. On my right, Dr. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who's now the president of the American Action Forum, which he founded about 15 years ago. Dr. Holtz-Eakin started out as an academic teaching economics at Columbia and at Syracuse University, where he was the head of the Maxwell School, or senior economist at the Maxwell School of Public Policy. From 2003 to 2005, he was the 6th director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. He was the director of domestic and economic policy for the McCain presidential campaign. So we're going to start off by talking some about the macroeconomics of the budget deficit and the debt and why we should pay more attention to it. So Bill, I'm going to turn to you for some opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I'm sure Doug feels the same way. I'm very pleased to be here and to talk about this important issue. And if you'll forgive me, I'm going to read something because this is such an issue. I get so emotional about it, I lose my way. There are a few policy people today who would actually argue that there's a good effect from raising debt. You'll notice that everyone's running around from. Well, there are a few, but the salutary effect of rapidly increasing debt is losing its fan base. It seems like everyone is sounding alarms about our level of publicly held debt, the pace at which it's rising, and the prospects for more debt to come. The question of the day is what to do about it. The de facto answer is hand the problem on to somebody in the future, some cohort in the future. That might be a future Congress, though they would likely also hand the problem off, or it might be to a reform movement that corrects financial imbalances in the principal drivers of the debt. I will argue that the most direct way to address the debt crisis is through some comprehensive program that involves revenues, program reforms, general budget discipline, and regulatory reform. How does that fit? All of these departments of public finance are contributing something to our current debt crisis, and all need to be partners in its solution. Before I address that path forward, there's a crucial context for any effort to alter our debt. The 230-year-old pillar of public finances here in the United States, this norm, it's named after Alexander Hamilton, would really put the country into a position of committing itself to having quality debt that could be negotiated at any time as an instrument in any kind of asset transfer that would keep its quality and would be non-inflationary. The new republic needed to swiftly assure its major creditors, primarily Dutch and the French, that we would repay our debts and be a good credit risk. A substantial amount of the credit for establishing our financial system goes to Alexander Hamilton, and that's why we call it the Hamiltonian norm. Over the course of the next 200 years, this Hamiltonian norm meant that the United States always worked to repay its debts. Our monetary system was one of low inflation, thus supporting the value of our bonds instead of letting inflation devalue them. And our fiscal programs would not endanger that norm. This Hamiltonian regime means that deference is given to the value of our money and our credit. Congress defers to the monetary authorities. Another way of naming this regime is monetary dominance. That means the inflation rate stays on a target thanks to the actions of the central bank and the productivity of the economy. And Congress restrains spending whenever publicly held debt gets too high. When Congress continues to spend above its revenues and adds more red ink to its already high level of debt, this behavior could lead to something called fiscal dominance. This is the state of financial affairs, of which I believe we have today, that prevails when our central bank is primarily reacting to the financing of the needs of Congress. Fiscal dominance occurs when the central bank, Federal Reserve, has to continuously supply credit to meet the spending needs or the spending requirements of Congress. In this scenario, the bank supports excessive debt increases by tolerating an inflation above its target level while facilitating the purchase of new government bonds by the banking system. We all know the United States hasn't always abided by the Hamiltonian norm, sometimes because emergencies forced higher spendings and large debt increases. That said, into the 20th century, or really most of it, Congress and the President generally worked to restore balance and resume Hamiltonian adherence as quickly as possible. Perhaps the most heroic and overlooked effort to restore the norm occurred during the administrations of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge. These presidents, particularly Coolidge, worked diligently to reduce massive spending and debt increases stemming from World War I. President Coolidge reported in 1925 that outlays, this is amazing, that outlays had fallen 41% from peaks set by wartime spending, and the nation's debt had declined by 14%. This progress in constructive economy, that's his term, permitted Congress to develop historic tax reduction legislation, which it passed the following year in the Revenue Act of 1926. Now, I'm about to conclude. The parallels between our times and the early 1920s are truly striking. Both periods had massive pandemics. Great Spanish flu outbreak following World War I, our own coronavirus, as we're all too painfully aware. Both economies supported significant war expenditures, in which the war expenditure was rising, not falling. Both saw rapidly rising debt. In fact, the debt increases in World War I and following World War I up through about 1922 were some of the most severe and highest in our nation's history, outstripping what we had during the Revolutionary War. Both the early 1920s and our own period of time saw severe recessions. The 1921 recession is, by some measures, even greater than that which occurred prior to 1931. Strong inflation. We forget that that period was one of significant inflation, just very significant inflation, much like our own period. And of course, the factionalism of that period, where people were being thrown into jail, riots in the streets, burning in New York, socialists being deported back to Europe. It was a period of fearsome political contest. All of these challenges were largely or wholly resolved by the end of the 1920s, every one of them. Is this something that we can learn now 100 years later? The public finance program of the 1920s involved cutting away outmoded regulations and nuisance taxes. It was a simple but very effective way to increase productivity. Bringing down individual and corporate income and profits taxes from levels as high as 70% to down into the mid-20s. And adjusting the budget. This is Coolidge gets a bad rap for being quiet and being mean. But he was actually adjusting the budget the last year in this massive overall comprehensive plan to restore the Hamiltonian norm during the 1920s. As a result of this policy program, federal debt declined across the 1920s, as did consumer prices. So we didn't have a 3% annual growth rate in the CPI. CPI didn't exist at that time, but the Atlanta Fed has reconstructed it. And their estimate is that we had a cumulative decrease of 4% between 1921 and 1928. Lower taxes, lower fees, smaller budgets, less debt, declining prices, all with an average inflation-adjusted economic growth rate from 1920 to 1929, inflation-adjusted growth rate of 4.5% per year, 4.5% per year in a mature economy. And per capita income growth of 3.8% per year. So our times are different, Tom, than those times were. But I think what we want to do is think about a comprehensive approach. We cannot control our spending unless we restore the Hamiltonian norm. Around the world, we know that legislative bodies, once they get used to spending, continue to spend. That fiscal dominance is hard to break. So while we can talk about reforms to mandatory programs, we can talk about budget process reforms, all of these things are important. They have to happen within the context of a commitment to preserving the quality of our debt and never letting inflation and never letting excessive spending undercut it. And then we can do things like, for example, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Before the act, only 7% of our interest payments were paid for by revenues. The rest were borrowed funds. Since the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we've had a huge improvement. Now 10% are paid by revenues and not by borrowed funds. We can go from the CPIW to the CPI and COLA adjustments. Do little things, take small steps. And then once we have taken those small steps and have saved millions, if not billions of dollars, and we have committed ourselves back to the norm, then I think it's much easier to do what we have to do, and what I hope Doug will talk about. And that is reform Social Security, Medicare, mandatory programs, the drivers. If you start there, you lose. If you work your way in with the context of a commitment to the norm, maybe you can win.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I'm going to come back to you and press you a little bit on some of the specifics. But first, Doug, we would welcome some general thoughts from you to start off with.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for the chance to be here today. It's great to talk about such an uplifting topic first thing in the morning. We can all go drinking at lunch. I think the basic setting is one in which we have two preeminent policy problems: poor economic growth and ever-rising federal debt. And in my mind, they're closely related. Certainly in the 20th century, GDP per capita, a crude measure of the standard of living income per person, grew at an average annual rate of 2.4% between 1960 and 2000. And if the economy grows at that pace, the standard of living doubles roughly every 29 years. So in one working career, the standard of living doubles. People have their access to the American dream. In the 21st century, where we have been unable to control the debt, it has only risen even relative to the size of the economy, GDP per capita is growing at 1.4%. And the standard of living now doubles every 56 years. And in the public discourse, there's a palpable sense of people not having access to the American dream, being unable to pursue the things that their parents and grandparents pursued. I'd like to have grown at 2.4%. That makes a huge difference in how the economy forms. If we'd grown at 2.4% in the 21st century, everyone in this room would have another $19,000. I'd like my 19. I don't know if you'd like your 19. The federal government would have $1.2 trillion more in revenue each year, facing $20 trillion in budget deficits over the next 10 years. That $12 trillion would be a real jump head start on taking care of the problem. So that's what's at stake. And I think a ruthless commitment to enhancing the pace of growth in the United States, giving to the next generations an economy that is larger and stronger than the one we've inherited, that's something we've lost and something we need to focus on. We will, in the process, ensure that the debt is well respected around the globe. There's no reason to endanger that, that's for sure. But I think it's the quality of the American dream that's at stake here, and we really do need to take care of it. The other thing I'd just point out is that economies grow by doing very simple things. You save, invest in the future, do something which provides better skills for your workers, better equipment for them, new business models. That is the sort of bread and butter of economic growth. And the federal budget and the debt that's financing the federal budget is one of the greatest anti-growth entities on the planet. The basic idea in most federal programs is to subsidize consumption. Politicians like to give you something to make you feel good now, and this comes at the expense of the future. So the entire federal budget is essentially designed to take resources from the private sector where they might be saved, invested for the future, and put them into public programs which are meant to subsidize consumption. We'll talk about Social Security, it's inevitable. The whole point of Social Security is to have the elderly live better in old age, subsidize their consumption. The whole point of Medicare is to subsidize their consumption. The whole point of most programs, when you think about it, is to just subsidize someone's consumption. If you take that too far, you will not grow as a nation, and we are not growing. And as a result, we don't have the $19,000 per person that we might want to devote to other important national priorities like national security, a cleaner environment, anything you might want to be able to pursue, those resources aren't available. So I think that's where we really need to focus, and we haven't. I view this as all happening on my watch. So people always ask me, like, what happened, Doug? Like, you were at the White House in 2001, 2002. You ran the CBO. You ran the McCain campaign policies. You've been in Washington for 21 years. It's all gone to hell. Like, maybe it's your fault. It's like, okay, possibly. So I thought about it for a while, and I think that a key part of the landscape is this. There's this old maxim that budget is policy. So if you go back and look at the budgets of the Bush administration, what those budgets really say is we're going to win the war against global terror at all costs. We're not going to worry about things like fiscal balance, things like that. We have a threat to this nation. We're going to take it on. If you look at the Obama era, certainly they weren't worried about the budget. They did the Affordable Care Act, added another big new spending program. And those budgets say as long as the rich pay their fair share, we're fine. Look at the Trump administration. They said nothing for 4 years. There's just radio silence. The Biden administration came in with all sorts of big new programs that they wanted to have. If you look at that era, the most important elected leaders, the most important thought leaders, the most important public educators in this country said to the American people, there's no problem. Yeah. They are blissfully unaware that there's a problem with the federal budget and that it threatens their future. And that has to change. Our leaders have to step up and educate people on the benefits of taking care of business and putting the federal budget in order. We did that in the late 90s. And then Secretary Rubin said, look, we have to do tough things. We have to try to balance the budget. If we do, we will keep the bond market under control, and we will grow as a nation. And it worked. And so we need to get back to that commitment. There's a benefit out there that people need to recognize. This isn't all pain. This is about doing better in our economic lives.
So Doug, let me press you a little bit on this idea that federal spending is mostly designed to enhance consumption. There's been a lot of programs that have been adopted, especially in this administration, but not limited to this administration, that can be characterized as industrial policy of one sort or another. And the rubric is always used as investment. We're investing in semiconductors, we're investing in green technology. Over the weekends, Majority Leader Schumer suggested spending another $30 billion or more a year on artificial intelligence. Are these investments in our future that are going to enhance growth in your view?
So, I was trying to simplify by saying they basically subsidize consumption. In some cases, we just waste the money. And that's what I think of these as doing. I mean, this is taking investment dollars and sinking them into politically preferred investments, not those that are matching the market rate of return and generating the productivity growth that we'd like to see in the economy. So periodically, the U.S. veers into having political steering of private investment funds. It never works out very well, and we try to relearn the lesson and stay out of industrial policy. We're in one of these moments where, out of fear of China, not anything more complicated than that, we're engaged in this again. It will not work. We will regret it in the end, and we will be effective in meeting the challenges of Russia, China, and the 21st century by reliance on private sector decision-making for investments.
Let me just key off what you just said, because it's a really important point. So let's imagine a world in which private firms believe they can double their profits by investing in artificial intelligence. Is there anyone here who would argue that they wouldn't do that? I think they would do that. They might do it on a scale less grandiose than what has been envisioned, but investments in that technology would occur and have occurred and have occurred for some time. Machine learning is the first stage of artificial intelligence, and that machine learning has been financed almost entirely through private funds and then through public-private situations, no doubt about that. Or if there was a need for chips, do you think that all the government said, we're not going to do anything on chips, you think that there wouldn't be any chips? So the fact that our government is investing in artificial intelligence and chips doesn't mean that there won't be those things in the private sector, if they are in fact the things that drive profitability. I mean, that's a contestable argument, right? That's an argument in which we can have, and we have it in economics, is to what extent is there a necessity for public investment? But I think in a lot of things, we have to think of a world in which those investments aren't made by the public and that they would be made by the private. Do you disagree with that?
So, no, I think this is exactly right. I mean, take chips as a concrete example. The CHIPS Act began with the correct, in my view, observation that there were certain semiconductors used in national defense, some weapon systems and surveillance systems, that probably should be manufactured in the continental United States under special security provisions. There's nothing wrong with that. That's something that markets don't actually automatically do, which is generate the right national security environment. And you have the government there for a reason.
Right.
And then it morphed into a large handout program for well-connected states and companies. And I don't see any reason why Apple, which has hundreds of billions of dollars on its balance sheet, needs $50 billion from the taxpayer to make chips for phones. That's crazy. And there's no reason we should be doing it.
I want to focus a little bit on macroeconomic effects of our huge and continually growing debt. Bill, you have made the argument in some of your writings that the inflation that we've experienced the last 3 years or so is in large part due to the imbalance of the budget.
Right.
Could you sort of explain the dynamics of that?
Oh, well, yeah. So there's really strong evidence that in this particular episode of inflation, the root of that inflation was the monetization of about 70% of the budget deficits. So you can do this yourself. You can trace it pretty easily through government sources, which I did in a paper which I wrote for the Economic Policy Innovation Center. And the papers is inflation rooted in excessive budget deficits? That's not always the case. You can have short bursts of inflation because of shortages, conversion from a wartime to a peacetime economy, emergencies, big, catastrophic floods and so forth. Those are all kind of short bursts that the economy does a good job of reconciling over time through the normal processes of a market supply and demand. But when the federal government maintains a growing amount of deficits, and it's rapidly accelerating deficits, they have to fund those deficits, right? They fund them in the normal way, and they offer bonds to buyers, and the buyers buy those bonds, and banks are the big buyers of those bonds, or in the secondary market buy those bonds. Those bonds find their way into the asset column of banks, and banks are likely to lend that money out. So why didn't this happen in in 2010? We had a big period of stimulus spending by the Congress, you may remember, 2009, 2010. It's because Ben Bernanke, then chair of the Board of Governors, decided to insulate those deficits from becoming demand deposits by paying the banks not to lend them out. And so we didn't have a large amount of inflation during that period of time, but the current board decided that was a policy they would not follow because they believed that we needed to stimulate the economy following the great collapse in the labor markets of 2020. So, as I say, about 70% was my estimate of those deficits were monetized, were put into the economy, and aggregate demand took off, as it would. And it's not only the demand of households, but the demand of businesses as well. So there is a clear linkage, at least in my mind, between the growing and rapid and large deficits and the inflation which we've had. And that inflation broke out in 1921. So I'm the Commissioner of Labor Statistics during the worst time and best time in labor markets and the worst time in labor markets. When I became Commissioner in 2019, I got to announce the lowest unemployment rate since 1952, and a few months later, the highest unemployment rate in recorded BLS history. So I've seen it all, and I was watching the inflation build during the last few months of the Trump administration. Before it got into the CPI, I was seeing it in the international indexes, import and export indexes that we maintain. And it was big. We were having increases that were double digit before President Biden took office. After he took office, the spending continued and maybe it accelerated. But certainly more and more of those deficits were working their way into aggregate demand. So by the summer of 1921, so I'm too much of a Cooley's guy here today. So the summer of 2021, that is in June, May and June, finally the CPI reacted to what was happening in the PPI and in the import and export indexes previously. And we saw these rapid increases that worked their way almost up to 10% on an annual rate. Those all, in my view, Tom, stemmed in from the deficits. Yes, there were supply disruptions, no question about that. But as I say, the market mechanisms in our developed international economy are well suited for taking care of supply disruptions over a relatively short amount of time. And prices would indeed came down as those supplies were restored.
One more thing on the sort of the macroeconomic effects of large accumulated debt. I mean, I don't know what the current figure is. We're at 120% of GDP or 130%.
Debt in the hands of the public's about 100, ballpark.
Anyway,
Yeah,
last
we're not up there to 130 yet, but
We're working on it.
we're working on it.
So late last year, early this year, Secretary Yellen was worried that we were going to have some problems actually selling our treasury bonds. And the ratings agencies have now, Fitch has downgraded the treasury debt. I think it was Moody's
Negative watch.
has put a negative watch on. So that makes it more expensive for starters to finance our debt. But I wonder if there's not another impact globally. The Chinese are, with some of their allies, the Russians and others, are madly trying to undermine the dollar as the reserve currency.
Right.
Most global trade is still conducted in dollars because it was always viewed as the measure of stability. Are we losing that battle to protect the dollar as the world's reserve currency? And by the way, that gives us a lot of leverage when we impose sanctions on Russia and China because of the importance of the dollar as the measure of the currency of exchange.
Right.
Is that a problem we should be worried about?
It's not an imminent problem, but it is a problem we should worry about. I mean, the dollar as a reserve currency, it is a good thing for global trade to have a reserve currency. It minimizes the transaction costs, and so the whole notion that somehow we would move away from the dollar would be a big disruption to the international trade and finance regime. No reason to do it. It does give us additional leverage in geopolitical affairs. It does give us additional demand for treasuries because people want to have dollar-denominated assets to engage in these trades. And that gives us additional rope in our borrowing, which we regularly use. And that's what we need to sort of recognize, is that we endanger that status if we blithely just keep issuing debt that we don't need to be doing. The downgrades are an important phenomenon. Fitch downgraded the United States not because the economy is broken, not because it's not capable of raising the revenues to make timely repayment of interest and principal, but because the politics endangered the actual repayment of that interest and principal in a timely fashion. And that's a real lesson. We are being told we don't know how to manage our finances, and that's what we've seen recently. And that's a fair characterization. Further downgrades would follow, and our borrowing would be more expensive, and that's bad for everybody involved. So getting back to the notion where we have an agreement that we're trying to accomplish something from a fiscal point of view is I think really central to this moment. And you know, there are these sort of you know, different errors in policymaking in the US. So for those who are not nearly as old as I, in the 60s and 70s, economists somehow convinced themselves and many policymakers that we could manage business cycles from DC in this clever fashion where if we got in a recession, we'd cut taxes, increase federal spending, take the bottom out of that downturn. When we went into a boom, we could raise taxes and cut spending, shave the top off. We'd get less unemployment on average when we went down, less inflation when we came up. Life would be great. And it was a complete disaster. We averaged over 6% unemployment in the 70s, over 7% inflation. And one of the things that came out of the era of Paul Volcker breaking the great inflation of that era and the Reagan reforms to the fiscal house is that fiscal policy was set for purposes of long-run trend growth. And the Federal Reserve was essentially tasked with managing short-run business cycle-like fluctuations. And that regime was very successful in the 80s and 90s. It was an era of low and contained inflation, rapid productivity growth, Federal budget was balanced for the first time in decades and remained in balance for 4 straight years. And somehow, early in the 21st century, we lost that. And we went back to discretionary fiscal policies all the time. We had discretionary tax cuts in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2005, sent checks out in 2008. This became business as usual. And in the process, you notice the fiscal house just ended up in complete disarray. We didn't get better economic performance. So I think we need to go back to a regime that takes care of the reserves currency of the debt, takes care of the trend growth in the economy, and has a lot more virtues over the long term.
Right, and Doug, maybe I get your thinking on this because thinking about metrics, how do we know if we're successful making progress towards a better fiscal situation? I would think inflation would be important. I would think productivity growth would be important.
Yep.
You would want to see debt ratios declining relative to spending, but I think that a lot of the progress metrics should be in the macroeconomy. Do you?
I think that's right. I mean, from the reserve currency point of view, all you need to do is stabilize debt relative to GDP and then point it south, just a little bit. And then you will have said to global capital markets, hey, we can manage our finances and we'll take it down as far as we want to. Yeah. That takes all of the disaster scenarios off the table if you do that. That's hard work at this point. And then you'll get better economic performance. You'll get contained inflation. It's easier for the Fed if you've got a tight fiscal policy. They can be much more generous in monetary policy. Back them into a corner with a loose fiscal policy. They don't have much choice. You get the situation we're in now. So we'll get better macro performance, and then it will generate the resources where we can do what we want on a program by program basis. So that's I think important in the United States, because what we have right now is a situation where we have new generations of voters who come into the debate and they want things, and there is no money for it. Like, all the money is spoken for by some decision made in 1965, and it's extremely, I think, unfair in a representative democracy to have people come and be unable to have the government do the things they want. And so we need to come to terms with that.
It's also the fact that we have 2 hot wars and at least 1 cold war.
Well, one of the things they might want is to be safe.
We might want to devote some resources to that. Well, let's turn to the solution side, and I want to just get things going, ask each of you to give me your top 3 priorities about how to change the trajectory.
Can I do some table setting first?
Sure.
So here's the table setting. Do not remember these numbers. Certainly don't repeat them in polite company. You'll have no friends like me. All right. Over the next 10 years, baseline sort of projections, the federal government will spend $82 trillion. About 12 of it will be interest. About 20 of it will be annual decisions of Congress, discretionary spending, half of which is defense, half of which is non-defense. 50, the vast majority, is so-called mandatory spending, or entitlements in real people's language. And of that 50, 32 is Social Security and Medicare. So if you want to know where the money is in Social Security and Medicare. So they are big, and you don't deal with the federal budget unless you deal with them. That's sort of point number 1. And I'll just note, as a sort of symptom of our problems, both people running for president have said they will not touch Social Security or Medicare. So that's the political cutting problem of this era. Not only are they big, they grow faster than everything else. Social Security grows at 5.5% per year in the next 10 years, Medicare at 7%. There is no revenue source that will grow at that rate. Revenues grow at roughly the rate of the nominal economy. So if you have 2% real growth plus 2% inflation target, revenues are going to grow about 4%. So they're huge, and they're pushing the budget into divergence. I say this because, number 1, it focuses attention on Social Security and Medicare, which is necessary. And if people are talking about something else and saying they're solving the problem, they're not. Second is, it tells you why just raising taxes will never work, because you can raise the level of taxes, but they're still diverging. All you do is patch the problem for a little while, and then it comes back. You have to deal with the growth rate of Social Security and Medicare, or you never get a permanent solution.
Well, I mean, it's the third rail. So is there?
Well, as I said, no president has said we need to deal with this. So if you're a congressman, you go to town hall and you say, I'd like to touch Social Security, you're unemployed.
So Doug and I
you need some help.
Doug and I still have bandages on from our efforts to privatize certain parts of Social Security. Years and years ago, privatization maybe is the wrong term, but at least create personal retirement accounts. So someone asked me the other day, well, how would you fix Social Security if you had a radical wand and you could do whatever you wanted to do? And I'm old enough I can actually say this without worrying about my resume. I think there still is opportunity for a personal retirement account solution, but it can't be comprehensive. We've gone past that point. So here's one thought. We have about 2 million people every year who reach the age of 18. And they begin, 18 is not a magical age, but let's just choose it. That's an age in which a lot of them begin to work for themselves. Some go to college, a lot of them get jobs. Income begins to flow to them, and of course then they begin to pay payroll taxes. Well, one way of kind of relieving the stress on Social Security is to say to the 18-year-olds, you have two options. You can stay in the system or you can opt out. And if you opt out, your retirement accounts will be managed by private sources from your payroll taxes. You still pay payroll taxes, but those will go into a private account. And the private firm will pay the federal government the net present value of what your payouts will be in 60, 70 years, thus infusing money right now into the Social Security system while keeping millions of people every year out of ultimately the pay-as-you-go system that we have now. Now, that's a crazy idea, I know, but when we're talking about structural reform, getting to a structural answer, you have to change one of the big levers. You have to change participation at the front end, or you have to change participation at the back end. Opt-out solutions have been talked about, where people walk away from their earnings and just opt out and no longer pay any taxes into the system. Raise retirement ages, which is very controversial, I must tell you, or cut benefits. So we're past easy solutions, in my view. Now we can have incremental solutions like changing the COLA adjustment on Social Security, which adds minor dollars, but should be done. The big levers, and Doug, would you just disagree? I mean, there's a lot of things we discussed 20 years ago, 25 years ago, which were very doable. Had we made the move, we would be in much better shape now. But now, there aren't a lot of easy solutions out there for structural change. They require the big movers to occur. I think there's a commitment to Social Security and Medicare, which is enduring and probably will be fundamental. So if there is, we need to make that big move now before it even gets more difficult to change the system. And some of the big ideas that are kind of being booted around, the crazy ideas, now they're no longer possible.
Yeah. So in 2003-4, when then President Bush was proposing Social Security reform, I was the CBO director. And when I talked to members, my bumper sticker for Social Security reform was "Get Doug Holtz-Eakin," because I was a high lifetime earner who didn't need the Social Security system as it had been designed. And I was also the trailing edge of the baby boom generation. So if you didn't get me, you didn't get the baby boom generation, which means you grandfathered the demographic problem. And that's what we've done. So it is past easy changes to the system that you can implement over long periods of time. We have a much harder problem now.
Yeah, that's right.
So what can you do? You can do a number of things to slow the growth rate and benefits. And again, it's not cutting benefits, the way people characterize it. It is having benefits grow, but grow more slowly than promised. And so it's delivering less than you were promised, but more than you will get if you do nothing. Because if we do nothing, there's a 21% across the board cut in 10 years when the trust fund exhausts. So that's sort of important in two ways. One, mechanically, what you're doing is avoiding that and giving people more than they would get under current law. And you can do that by indexing things. You can more aggressively means test for the high lifetime earners. The left is adamant about not taking people off Social Security, but I really don't see why Elon Musk, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, go down your list of of people, the system is in a position where if we're going to stabilize the finances, we might have to make more radical changes and take them off the rolls entirely. And but certainly you have to mean test much more aggressive, much more than we do now. I think there's no way around that.
I want to take a quick look at the revenue side.
And you do have to do more revenue.
Okay, candidate Trump has promised to increase tariffs quite a bit, and he seems to think that will be a great source of revenues. If I have read your stuff right, you would endorse a carbon tax of some sort, a border adjustable carbon tax, maybe?
In some circumstances, yes, but not for Social Security. For Social Security, it's a payroll tax-driven system.
Just for general revenue purposes.
No, only if you're going to get rid of all the junk that they call climate policy and want to have a climate policy, then you should have a very disciplined upstream carbon tax that's border adjusted. I support that, but not that and all the nonsense that's going on right now.
Is there any merit to thinking about tariff income like we did 200 years ago as a major source of our revenues?
No.
Okay. Are there any revenues that you guys would support?
Yeah. So I think you, if you're doing Social Security reform, which I think we need to do, and here's why. Under current law, when the trust fund exhausts, and so payroll taxes come in, they get deposited. When benefits need to be paid, they come out of the trust fund. For a long time, there were more payroll taxes than benefits, and the trust fund accumulated Treasury securities. We've been running deficits for a while. It's going down. 10 years, they go away, and you can only pay what's in the trust fund. That would be each year's payroll taxes. So that's a 21% cut across the board to people in retirement. That's unthinkable. That's not going to happen. We know that. We'll have the Senate in their pajamas voice voting a reform at the last minute before that happens. But what that means is if you're 55 right now and you're thinking about retiring at 65, you have no idea what your Social Security benefit is going to be because you have no idea what they're going to do. That's a terrible way to run a pension program. I mean, it's literally disgraceful. This is a terrible program. This is the United States of America. We should have a program that's financially sustainable upon which people can make some plans. That to me is part of the political dynamic that's going to change what we've seen so far, where it's been an untouchable third rail. People are going to want to know what the deal is. They're going to say, you got to fix this. People are starting to do the arithmetic, realize we have a larger budgetary problem. This is one piece of it. I see the next 5 years is the key moment where we come to terms with this and start really getting it fixed up. So of the revenues I would touch in Social Security, I would just simply raise the taxable maximum to cover 90% of wages as it did at the beginning and be done. And you can do the rest on the spending side.
I just wonder how much time we actually have.
Well, no one knows.
I mean, no. I mean, to fix the problem, we seem to, and I think it's perfectly normal, just to say, well, we've got time to fix this, and it's based on this history. We've never been called to account yet, so therefore the future is like the past, right? But Doug, I mean, we've got accelerating interest payments that we have to borrow to pay. We are borrowing to pay our interest. We have Fitch, Moody's, and S&P all, in a sense, negative about our future. Fitch's, by the way, was maybe the worst because it said we don't know. Not only is the future grim, but we don't know what we're doing to fix it. And so, don't you think at some point a bond issue is not going to fully sell? There's going to be some kind of financial crisis with respect to the dollar holdings by some bank in Europe. I mean, don't we risk by delay, at least signaling that we're serious about the problem, we're accelerating a financial crisis?
So the answer to all of those is yes, but we don't know the time scale on that. Right?
That's it.
The crisis happens at a point where people lose confidence in the United States.
Right.
There's no financial indicator of that. There's no metric that says you're crossing the line. It just says that we lost confidence in your ability. And remember, this is a global economy and everything's relative. So we lose confidence in the US relative to the other options. So we buy ourselves a lot of time because we're the best looking horse in the global glue factory. That's
So
what
we
we
have
are.
to take steps right now
But
to raise confidence, right?
but you don't want to find out how much time you have. Like, 'cause there's no reason to run the experiment.
Right.
Like, start fixing things, start talking about fixing things. You know, people always talk about Japan. Oh, look, they have tons of debt, and they didn't have a crisis. Having a crisis is failure. Not having a crisis is getting a D.
Right.
I think we should aim higher than a D. I mean, you know, we got to get serious about this. But I don't think we're going to get serious in 2 years because the people running for president aren't serious people, though.
Right.
That's our problem.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then throw it open to the audience for further questions. But the three of us have been at this for quite some time and seen a lot of efforts that come under the rubric of process reform, budget acts, debt limit acts. We had David Malpass in this room a couple months ago advocating for more rigorous enforcement of the debt limits.
Right.
Do either of you have any confidence that any sorts of process reforms could have some impact on the problem?
The second CBO director, Rudy Penner, famously said, "The problem is not the process, the problem is the problem." Rudy was right then, and that's where we are now. Fix the problem.
So I would just add to that. So Congress has very few good, reliable channels for addressing a problem. To have a debate on the budget, it's very difficult to have in Congress. They debate about programs, but the process of forming a budget in the same year that you're doing appropriations is problematic in my view. So I think we could encourage better debate and more deliberation on solutions by changing some of the budget processes. I don't know how many people have looked into the biennial budgeting process. It is kind of attractive because it takes appropriations 1 year and puts the budget formation in another year, not in the same year, so you've got a 2-year budget cycle. Seems like that might be one way to engender a little bit more meditation on the problem and deliberation on the solutions. So I agree with you. I don't think process is going to solve your problems.
It won't, but here's the part I do believe. So first of all, just so that everyone uses terms in the same way, there is no budget for the federal government.
Yeah.
There is no document upon which there is agreement between the White House, the House, and the Senate, and there never has been. So we don't have a budget. We have budgetary outcomes, usually bad, and we should stop pretending we have a budget. Mm-hmm. We could do process reforms in the House and Senate, and the virtue of those would be that if this Congress or the next Congress did those reforms, they would own them, and they would have said publicly, this is how we should do business. We shouldn't be doing CRs and then doing appropriations halfway through the fiscal year. We shouldn't be doing X, Y, and Z. We should do it this way. And for a while, that would stick. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the virtue of process reforms. It doesn't even matter what they are.
Right. Yeah.
Because right now, they have the dead hand of the authors of the Budget Act of 1974 telling them what to do, and they don't care.
Yeah,
exactly. And you see it all the time.
Yeah, bingo.
Okay, any questions, John? Thank you. Could you tell us your name and
there's a microphone.
State a succinct question?
Sure. Jonathan Ward, I'm at Hudson Institute. The question I have for each of you is, what do you think the maximum achievable American growth rate is in the next 5 to 10 years? And what are 3 things each of you would, if you could execute 3 things in Washington to get there, what would they be?
So I think we can have an upswing in productivity. I think that is likely to come. First off, our population is going to be steady, if not growing, by mid-century because of immigration. And immigrants do wonderful things in the country. They generally bring new ideas and energy and youthfulness. So that's a positive. Our ability to invest in productive activity is really quite good. And we have the prospects of technologies which will be labor enhancing. I'm particularly interested in this notion of enhanced labor, which is learning machines that do the same work as human beings and work in concert with human beings. Generally speaking, when you have technology changes like that, human beings have more jobs to do, and there's more goods to be produced. So I'm positive on that, and so my long-term growth rate is above 3%. It's not at 4, but it's right in the neighborhood of 3 to 3.5%.
That's a good neighborhood. I mean, I think that's a sensible one. The demographics are what they are. That's important. I would say that I would start at the base, and the base problem is we have a K-12 education system that is an utter disaster.
Yeah.
And we have a quarter to a third of students coming out of it who are seriously deficient in reading and math. They will never be productive members of the labor force in the way that we need. And so fixing the human capital problem right at the beginning would be top priority. Second priority would be to reform mandatory spending programs to get the budget back in some sort of semblance of order and the debt trajectory stabilized relative to GDP. That's the big work that would have to happen in this town. That'll take as well a more efficient tax system that raises the revenue we need. We're about to enter into that debate next year about what does pro-growth tax reform look like in the context of getting the fiscal house in order. Those are the three things we have to do.
Sir.
Thank you. I'm Bill Strong. I'm a big fan of the Hudson Institute. Thank you to each of the three of you for being here. Here's a question. You've described in the last hour simple solutions that would solve the Social Security problem, Medicare. They're not complicated solutions. It's the political will to actually do them.
Yep.
And my theory is, and I'll pose this question to all of you, is that we're not going to do anything about it until the American public knows more about it and is panicked about it, and where they can see it a year from now, 2 years from now. I think we can do all the talking we want, but there's no discussion about it really around the country, other than in a room like this. How can we change that, or are we not going to be able to change it, and we're going to have to wait until it's a crisis, and then we'll be fixing it with our pajamas on the floor of the Senate?
Not a sight I need. I agree with that. I think that it's a really good question. You either solve it by crisis or solve it by leadership. And the question is, how do you generate the next set of leaders that are interested in this? When I look at the sort of next couple of years, there are a whole bunch of triggers that will force discussion and raise this issue, and I think raise awareness. So when we had the big debt ceiling fight and got downgraded, they got rid of the debt ceiling. They suspended it until January 1, 2025. They literally picked January 1. That is a recipe for a nightmare. It snaps back into place. We're already above it. The Treasury has to engage in massive, extraordinary measures to get back under it. And a new Congress and a new president, the first thing on their agenda now is the fiscal health of the United States. That hasn't been the first thing on anyone's agenda for a long time.
Exactly.
And they can't dodge it. So that's going to start this debate. People are going to have to figure out, how did we get here? What are they doing? Well, they can't do much in the short run, but they're going to have to start talking about what they would do if they could, and I think that's be helpful. We have in 2025 the simultaneous sunset of the 2017 Tax Act and the enhanced subsidies in the Affordable Care Act. The deal for the past couple of Congresses has been, all right, you get your taxes, I get my enhanced premiums, we get a huge increase in the deficit. Will that be the same deal in 2025? That's an important discussion. How does that get resolved? Social Security is running out of money and people can't make a plan. That's going to start becoming more and more visible. And a set of voters, so I'll use my daughter as an example. My daughter thinks the United States should have a paid parental leave program for new mothers and fathers. You may or may not agree with that, but the point is, that's her preference, and there's no money for that. Like, people have talked about this for years in DC, but the trouble is there's no money. All the money is spoken for. So you're going to get a combination of pressures, I think, over the next couple of years that are going to surface this in a way that it hasn't happened for the past 20. And that'll be a good thing. And hopefully, we will get leadership out of that instead of just waiting for the crisis.
And I kind of think the inflation that we've been through and how it has activated people, and people are upset in all walks of life, is in fact kind of a public finance crisis when it's up here. So the people are activated. Congress should do something. We have a leadership society. We're a society based on people leading other people, and we're a big country, third biggest country in the world. So we also need leaders. We need to have an individual who will step forward and say, I own this crisis, this is what we want, like we have had in the past from time to time. And I think the public then would be very supportive of strong measures to restore fiscal discipline and financial balances. Yeah, I think I'm optimistic.
Last question, Pat. Here's the mic.
I think you really put your finger on it. You got to get the public engaged in this discussion.
Oh, yeah.
I've been involved. I'm Pat Malloy. I was on the staff of the Senate Banking Committee for 15 years. And then I was on the China Commission, which is a think tank for Congress on China, for 10 years. So here's, but David Walker, who used to be the head of the Government Accounting Office, has been after this idea that we need to create a commission, bipartisan, and I know some members of the House have had legislation to do that kind of thing. I think that would be a very good idea, that they go around the country and have meetings and talk with people, governors and others, about the situation we're presently in. But that's just a comment. Now, the question I have, I'm not an economist, I'm a lawyer, but because I was on the Senate Banking Committee, I heard a lot of economists through the years, including Volcker and Greenspan, but economists have a formula for GDP, which includes the term net exports, that when you run negative net exports, you detract from GDP growth. Last year, we had $1 trillion trade deficit in manufactured goods. Over the last probably quarter century, we probably had around 12 or $13 trillion worth of negative net exports. Do you think, and I've read Bob Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, and he's worried about the trade deficits as well. Do you think some way of setting a national goal to balance our trade would help grow our economy faster than if we continue the road we're on now?
Yeah. So I'm an unreconstructed free marketeer, and I'm unapologetic on that, right? And here's the way I think about the border. The border is very important for all kinds of security purposes, so forth and so on. But in a world in which every economy is trying to find, what am I good at? What are my people good at? We should let that happen. And trade will go across, in my perfect world, go across borders based on comparative advantage. If we have dumping, if we have illegal activity, if we have aggressive governments trying to destroy another economy, that's a defense matter. That's a matter for the president to step forward and say, this has to stop. We need a border that's porous. We go across, we specialize in our goods and services. That is going to make us richer. The net exports is required in order to do the GDP accounting. We need to know what gross domestic product is, because that's all value, the value of all goods and services produced in the United States. So we need a way in which we can net out what's coming across the border. And I'm not that concerned about those net exports. I'm more concerned about whether or not we're being allowed to find our comparative advantage and compete in the world. That's my focus.
Doug, you want to weigh
By
in?
and large, I think Bill's got that right. I just want to say a word about fiscal waking up. So I joined Mr. Walker on fiscal wake-up tours. We went from town to town and described the future, and you can see what it accomplished. So I'm not convinced that's going to do it, and I'm not a big fan of commissions per se. In the end, elected members of the House and Senate have to stand on the floor and take a vote. And there's no commission that is a substitute for that. They have to be willing to make the right choice for the future. And so far, they haven't been. So it's about getting the elected people to do their job.
We had the Simpson-Bowles Commission that
Commission anecdotes, okay? So I was on the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which was convened by Congress and was supposed to provide a coherent explanation of how the crisis happened, and did not do any such thing, accomplished nothing. And it thus, continued the legacy of nearly every commission. George Washington appointed the first commission. Our first president did the first commission. It was tasked with solving what became the Whiskey Rebellion. History will show that the commission failed. He had to send in the troops. Commissions are not the answer to anything.
Okay, well, unfortunately, on that relatively negative note, you've been a very patient audience. This is somewhat esoteric stuff, and there's not a lot of hope, but this country has gone through a lot of problems over the long course of time, and I, for one, think that, as Winston Churchill said, after we've tried all the alternatives, we inevitably come around to to the right solution. So let's look forward to that day. And thank you for being a patient audience.